The morning of June 18, 1815 began not with the thunder of cannons, but with the soft, unrelenting patter of rain. It had poured all night, drenching the Belgian countryside and turning the fields of Waterloo into a quagmire of mud and misery. For Napoleon Bonaparte, it was supposed to be the day he reclaimed his glory, the day he proved that destiny still bent to his will. But destiny had other plans that began with something as simple as the weather. Napoleon stood outside his tent before dawn, wrapped in his gray greatcoat, gazing toward the dark horizon. His men were exhausted, soaked, and cold, yet their spirits were high. They trusted their emperor. They had followed him from Italy to Egypt, from Austerlitz to Moscow. They believed that even after exile, he had returned to finish what he started, to restore France's greatness and crush the coalition that dared to oppose him. But beneath the confidence, Napoleon was uneasy. His scouts reported that the ground was nearly impassable. The heavy artillery, his greatest strength, would have to wait until the earth dried. Every delay, every hour lost gave his enemies time to regroup. The field itself was deceptively simple, a rolling stretch of farmland bordered by hedgerows, forests, and small villages. To the north, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, waited with his Anglo-Allied army. To the east, far beyond the mist, the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher was marching to join the fight. Napoleon knew that if he struck quickly, before the Prussians arrived, he could defeat Wellington and turn his forces against Blücher in time. But the rain had ruined everything. His cannonballs, instead of bouncing and tearing through enemy lines as they had done in his earlier victories, would now sink into mud. His cavalry, instead of charging like thunder, would stumble and slide. The greatest general of his age found himself at the mercy of nature. As dawn gave way to gray daylight, the emperor paced in silence. His staff, Ney, Soult, Drouot, and others waited for his command. But the ground was still too wet. Hours passed. Wellington, cautious and patient, used the time well. He positioned his troops behind the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, out of sight and protected from French artillery. He reinforced the farmhouses of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, turning them into fortresses. Every minute Napoleon hesitated, Wellington grew stronger. When the bombardment finally began around 11:30 a.m., it was already too late. The French cannons thundered, but their power was muted by the soggy terrain. The shots sank into the ground, kicking up mud instead of splinters. The air filled with smoke, the acrid scent of gunpowder mingling with the smell of wet earth. Across the field, Wellington watched calmly through his telescope, knowing that nature was on his side. "Give me night," he once said, "or give me Blücher." And both were coming. Napoleon's infantry advanced through the mire, their boots sticking with every step. Drums rolled, trumpets blared, and the tricolor fluttered defiantly against the gray sky. The emperor's plan was to break Wellington's center while distracting his flanks, but nothing moved as it should. Horses slipped. Cannons bogged down. The proud French formations that had once marched like clockwork now struggled to keep order. The very ground seemed to conspire against them. At Hougoumont, British guardsmen held firm against repeated French assaults. The fighting was savage, hand-to-hand, musket to bayonet. Flames consumed the barns and walls, but still the defenders stood. Napoleon had intended it as a diversion, but it became a battle within the battle, a drain on French strength and morale. "Hougoumont is the key," Wellington later said, and it was never taken. Meanwhile, Napoleon's Grand Battery continued to roar, but its effect was pitiful compared to Austerlitz or Wagram. The emperor watched through his spyglass, his jaw tightening. He knew that in this war, time was everything, and time was slipping away. By early afternoon, the mud was more than a nuisance, it was a prison. The cannon carriages groaned, their wheels buried to the hubs. Couriers struggled to deliver orders. Men and horses alike were covered in grime. Yet still Napoleon pressed on, driven by the same force that had carried him across half of Europe, sheer willpower. To retreat was unthinkable. To delay further was to surrender the initiative. So he ordered Marshal Ney to lead a massive cavalry assault, hoping to smash through Wellington's weakened lines. It was a fateful decision. Ney, brave but impetuous, charged with thousands of cuirassiers, men in gleaming armor, their helmets flashing like lightning beneath the clouds. They galloped uphill through the muck, sabers drawn, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" But Wellington's infantry had formed squares, dense, bristling formations of bayonets. The cavalry crashed against them again and again, unable to break through. Musket fire tore through the French ranks. Horses reared, fell, and rolled. The wet ground absorbed the shock of each charge, robbing it of power. It was a massacre in slow motion. From his command post, Napoleon watched, grim and silent. He had seen victory slip away before, at Leipzig in Russia, but never like this. This was not the fault of generals or plans. This was something deeper, almost cosmic. The very earth beneath him had turned traitor. He could not maneuver. He could not strike with the precision that had once made his name legendary. Every lesson of war he had mastered was undone by mud. By late afternoon, the battlefield had become an ocean of exhaustion. Smoke and rain mingled into a gray haze. Thousands lay dead or dying. The French infantry, battered but unbroken, tried once more to seize La Haye-Sainte, the farmhouse at the center of Wellington's line. After brutal fighting, they captured it, but at a terrible cost. And just as they did, a distant rumble echoed from the east. It was not thunder this time. It was Blücher's Prussians arriving at last. Napoleon turned sharply toward the sound. His eyes narrowed. He had hoped to crush Wellington before the Prussians appeared, but the delay, the cursed delay, had doomed him. Now he faced two armies instead of one. He sent word to his subordinates to hold the line, but his forces were stretched thin. The mud that had trapped his cannons now trapped his fate. Evening descended, cold and merciless. The Prussians struck Napoleon's right flank, forcing him to divert his reserves. Ney begged for infantry to support another attack on the ridge, but there were none left to give. The Imperial Guard, the last proud remnant of Napoleon's elite soldiers, was summoned. These were the veterans who had never known defeat, the men who had marched under the eagle from Madrid to Moscow. As they advanced, the Emperor's presence electrified them. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Perhaps, just perhaps, the legend of Napoleon could defy fate once more. The Guard climbed the ridge through smoke and rain, under relentless fire. "Vive l'Empereur!" they cried. But when they reached the crest, the British held firm. A sudden volley of musket fire shattered their ranks. The invincible Guard wavered, then broke. Panic rippled through the French army. "La garde recule!" Someone shouted. "The Guard is retreating." It was the first time those words had ever been spoken. Napoleon's face turned pale. The impossible had happened. His secret weapon, his discipline, his genius, his aura of invincibility, was gone. The mud that had swallowed his artillery now swallowed his empire. As night fell, the once mighty Grande Armée dissolved into chaos. Soldiers threw away their weapons, stumbling through the muck toward the south. Wagons overturned. Horses collapsed. The Emperor tried to rally them, but it was no use. He was no longer the master of Europe. He was a man defeated by rain, by mud, by time itself. He rode from the field in silence. Behind him, the cannons still smoldered, the cries of the wounded mingling with the distant sound of thunder. Waterloo was not just a battle lost, it was the end of an era. The empire that had reshaped the continent, the man who had once dictated the fate of nations, had been undone not by armies alone, but by nature's quiet rebellion. For centuries, historians have argued about what truly destroyed Napoleon at Waterloo. Was it Wellington's strategy? Blücher's arrival? Ney's reckless charge? All played their part. But beneath it all was the rain, the simplest, most relentless enemy of all. Without firm ground, Napoleon's cannons were useless. Without momentum, his cavalry floundered. Without the quick, decisive movement that had always been his hallmark, his brilliance was trapped. The storm the night before the battle was, in its own quiet way, the beginning of the end. In that sense, Waterloo was not merely a defeat. It was poetic justice. For years, Napoleon had believed he could bend the world to his will, command destiny as he commanded his troops. But on that muddy Belgian plain, nature reminded him, and all of Europe, that even the greatest of men are bound by forces beyond their control. Empires rise by genius and ambition, but they fall by chance, by weather, by the smallest turns of fate. As dawn broke the next morning, the rain had finally stopped. The fields were littered with the wreckage of a dream, broken sabers, shattered wheels, trampled flags. The once proud tricolor lay half buried in mud. Wellington surveyed the scene with weary eyes, murmuring, "A damn close-run thing." For him it was victory. For Napoleon it was oblivion. In the end, it wasn't a secret weapon forged in steel or strategy that destroyed his empire. It was something far more subtle, far more devastating. It was the silent weight of rain, the patience of mud, and the truth that even an emperor cannot march against the weather. The sun was sinking behind the rolling fields of Waterloo, its light dimming through a haze of smoke and drizzle. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once commanded the fate of empires, stood staring across a battlefield that was slipping out of his grasp. Around him, the thunder of guns had grown weaker, the cries of men fainter, replaced by a deeper, heavier silence. The silence that comes when the tide of war turns, and no amount of courage can stop it. For hours he had fought to bend destiny once again to his will, but now as the rain-soaked air thickened and the ground trembled under distant cannon fire, he began to sense the truth. His empire was dying before his eyes. In the chaos of the afternoon, as French formations shattered and reformed again and again, Napoleon's mind worked like a machine, calculating, adjusting, hoping. He had fought Wellington's army to a standstill. If the Prussians could just be delayed, if he could hold for a few more hours, victory might still be his. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. The British lines were battered. La Haye-Sainte had fallen. The Imperial Guard waited in reserve, a wall of veterans whose loyalty was as unshakable as steel. But fate had other plans. To the east, through the mist and smoke, the faint glimmer of bayonets appeared on the horizon. At first, some of Napoleon's men thought they were reinforcements, perhaps Grouchy's corps arriving at last. But soon came the shouts, the realization that chilled the blood of every French soldier. The Prussians were here. Blücher's army, driven by vengeance from the beating they had taken days earlier at Ligny, was marching straight toward the battlefield. And this time, nothing could stop them. Wellington, exhausted but alert, saw the moment unfold like a master gambler watching the final card turn in his favor. For most of the day, he had fought defensively, allowing the terrain and his discipline to absorb the furious assaults of Napoleon's army. His men had clung to every farmhouse, every ridge, every muddy patch of earth. Now, with Blücher's dark masses emerging from the eastern woods, Wellington gave a simple order. Hold the line. Help was on the way. Napoleon turned to his staff, his eyes sharp beneath his hat. "We must crush Wellington before Blücher arrives," he said. His voice, though calm, carried the strain of desperation. Messengers rode out. Orders were shouted through the rain. Marshal Ney, still covered in mud and gunpowder from his earlier charges, was told to press forward once more. The ground was soaked, the horses were exhausted, and yet again the French cavalry thundered toward the British ridge. It was a magnificent sight. Thousands of cuirassiers gleaming in the dim light, their armor streaked with rain, their cries echoing across the field. But it was also madness. Wellington's troops, veterans of countless battles across Spain and Portugal, had formed into tight squares. 4 walls of men, bristling with bayonets, disciplined and steady. The French cavalry smashed into them again and again, and each time they were thrown back, cut down by volleys of musket fire that tore through the smoke. Ney, fearless and unyielding, led charge after charge until his sword broke and his face was blackened with soot. Yet for all his bravery, the ground would not yield. As the last charge faltered, Napoleon's artillery opened up in fury, pounding the ridge in an effort to shatter the British defense. But the cannons, caked in mud, could not fire quickly enough. The ammunition wagons lagged behind, bogged down in the soaked fields. The Emperor watched, grim and motionless, as every advantage he had ever relied upon slipped away. The clock ticked. The sun sank lower, and the sound of Prussian drums grew louder. When Blücher's first columns appeared on Napoleon's right flank, it was like the arrival of a storm. The French, already stretched thin, turned to meet them, but they were too few. Napoleon sent whatever reserves he had left, units that had been meant to secure his final victory, just to hold the line. The battlefield became a whirlpool of confusion. Commands were lost in the noise. Formations broke apart. The smoke grew so thick that men fired blindly at shapes they could barely see. Wellington seized the moment. "Now, Maitland," he shouted, turning to one of his generals. Hidden behind the ridge, the British guardsmen waited, crouched and ready. When the French Imperial Guard began their climb up the hill, the proudest, most feared soldiers in Europe, Wellington's voice rang out, "Up, guards, and at them." What followed was one of the most dramatic moments in military history. The Imperial Guard, veterans of 100 battles, marched through cannon fire, their faces set with determination, They had never known defeat. Napoleon himself rode behind them, watching the advance that he hoped would snatch victory from disaster. The ground shook under their steady pace. "Vive l'Empereur," they cried. The British, silent until the last moment, waited until the guard was almost upon them. Then came a thunderous volley. Whole ranks of the guard fell. The survivors pressed on, but another volley followed and another. Smoke enveloped the hilltop. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard hesitated. Then, as if the very spirit of France cracked, they began to fall back. A ripple of disbelief swept through the French army. "La garde recule," someone shouted. "The guard is retreating." The word spread like fire. Discipline collapsed. Men who had fought all day now broke and ran. What had been a battle became a rout. Napoleon rode forward, shouting for his men to stand.
"They lie!"
"The guard does not retreat." But it was useless. The tide had turned completely. The Prussians smashed into the French right flank, and Wellington's army surged forward from the ridge. Drums beat, muskets flashed. The air filled with the roar of pursuit. The Grande Armée, once the most formidable force in the world, disintegrated into chaos. In the fading light, Napoleon's world came apart. The field that had once seemed a chessboard under his control was now a nightmare of mud, corpses, and fire. Wagons overturned in ditches, horses screamed. Soldiers threw away their weapons and fled south toward the road to Charleroi. The Emperor's carriage waited in the distance, but he lingered as though unable to accept what his eyes saw. His hat was gone. His face was streaked with rain and dirt. For a long moment he sat on his horse, silent, staring at the ruin of everything he had built. He had gambled everything on this day, his throne, his empire, his legend, and lost. The man who had once crowned himself Emperor of the French, who had marched through Europe undefeated, was now a fugitive. He had been undone not only by the strength of his enemies, but by time, by fatigue, by the simplest forces of nature. The Prussians gave no mercy. They pursued the fleeing French through the night. Wellington, his own army too battered to chase, stood upon the ridge and looked across the field of the dead. "By God," he murmured, "I don't think they know when they're beaten." But they were beaten utterly and finally. Napoleon reached the village of La Belle Alliance as darkness fell. Around him rode the remnants of his staff, their uniforms torn and mud-streaked. He spoke little. Those who were there later said that he seemed calm, too calm, as if his mind had already left the battlefield behind. He gave brief orders to regroup at Charleroi, but everyone knew the truth. The war was over. The empire was over. Back in Paris days later, he would try to muster defiance once more. He would speak of raising new armies, of defending France itself. But no one believed in him anymore. His marshals were weary. His people were exhausted. The legend that had carried him across Europe had evaporated in the rain at Waterloo. Within weeks he abdicated again, this time for good. Soon after, he surrendered to the British, hoping for mercy. Instead, he was sent into exile, far from France on the lonely island of St. Helena, half a world away from the fields that had once trembled beneath his boots. The Battle of Waterloo entered history not only as a military defeat, but as a symbol. The day the unstoppable met the inevitable. Wellington and Blucher had been the instruments, but the true secret weapon that destroyed Napoleon's empire was something far simpler: timing. Every decision, every delay, every stroke of fortune had aligned perfectly against him. The rain that slowed his artillery, the late start that gave the Prussians time to arrive, the exhaustion of his men after weeks of marching. Even the smallest moments, like a message delayed or a misunderstanding between generals, wove together into a pattern of fate that no human genius could undo. Napoleon had built his career on timing. His victories had always depended on striking faster, harder, and more decisively than anyone else. He understood momentum like no other commander of his age, but at Waterloo that momentum failed. The rhythm of war turned against him. Wellington waited. The rain fell. The ground softened. The hours slipped away. By the time the Emperor was ready to strike, the moment had already passed. In that sense, the secret weapon that destroyed Napoleon was not steel or gunpowder. It was patience. Wellington's calm endurance, Blucher's relentless march, the slow, grinding weight of time itself. Against all that, Napoleon's brilliance was useless. Years later, as he sat in exile, he would replay that day in his mind again and again. The storm, the mud, the delay, the guard's retreat. Each memory was a wound. Waterloo, he once said quietly, was a misfortune, but a fatal one. On that distant island, surrounded by the endless Atlantic, the man who had once ruled Europe spent his final years looking back at the one battle he could never win. Perhaps he understood in the end that no empire, no matter how vast, can outlast the turning of the world. The same forces that lift men to greatness, ambition, courage, vision, can also destroy them when the hour is no longer theirs. The story of Waterloo is often told as a clash of armies, but it is more than that. It is a story of inevitability. It is the moment when history itself decided to move on, when one man's will was no longer enough to shape it. Napoleon had conquered kingdoms, rewritten laws, reshaped nations. But at Waterloo, he met something greater than himself, the simple truth that every empire has its end. And as the night settled over the battlefield, with the rain still falling softly on the dead, it was as if the world itself was washing away the traces of his glory. The mud that had trapped his cannons now swallowed the banners and the bodies of his army. The echo of Vive l'Empereur faded into the wind. In the distance, the Allied fires burned through the night, marking the dawn of a new age, one without Napoleon. Europe would never be the same, but neither would the idea of greatness he had embodied. His fall was not just a military defeat. It was a reminder that even the most brilliant mind cannot command the weather, cannot control the clock, cannot outwit the turning of fate. When the sun rose over Waterloo the next morning, it illuminated a silent field. Smoke drifted like ghosts over the ruined farms. Horses lay motionless beside broken cannons. Flags lay torn and muddied in the grass. And somewhere in the distance, a rider carried the news that would change the world. Napoleon Bonaparte had been defeated once and for all. The empire was gone. The dream was over. The man who had once believed himself master of destiny was now its servant. His greatest enemy had never been Wellington or Blucher or the British guns. It had been time itself. The clock had struck its final hour, and all that remained was silence.